All right, man, so we're going to stick with PFF, their rankings, top 50 players. You mentioned how they value quarterbacks, and it seems like they valued another position too much in the top 10. We know the ranking as a whole, as we talked about, was very questionable, but the position they seemed to value quite a bit was wide receiver. They have 3 wide receivers in the top 10. Julio Jones at 3. You mentioned that. But what you didn't mention was Michael Thomas is at 6 and DeAndre Hopkins is at 9. Now, these players are ahead of other players that we already said were too low, like Khalil Mack and Stephon Gilmore, and we could go on from there. There's even Zach Martin, Bobby Wagner, a lot of guys that you could mention be ahead of these guys. And then quarterbacks, obviously they're ahead of Aaron Rodgers. The whole point of the main point of the last topic,
right?
They're ahead of some of these other guys. How do you feel about that one?
The thing, it's weird. There was 3 quarterbacks in the top 3, right? And then there was 3 receivers.
3 wide receivers.
So I don't understand how are they equally valuing receivers to quarterbacks? Receivers are a big part of modern day football, a lot bigger than they were in the 90s, in the 80s, 90s, and et cetera. But they're just like Colin Cowherd always says, they're the cherry on top. They're not the main ingredient for the recipe, but they're kind of like the whipped cream. Oh, it just adds a little flavor to it. And they might be a little more than that now with modern day football, but the 3 there, it does, and then you have 3 quarterbacks only there. So I don't know what if they're valuing more, if they're valuing them equal, which is not even close. Quarterbacks way more valuable, obviously. But Julio at 3, what was it? Hopkins at 9 and Thomas at 6. They're all probably top 3. They're top 3 receivers in the league. I think we can agree with that. But number 3, especially for Julio, that's just above Khalil Mack, above Russell Wilson, and 2 guys are above Russell Wilson in this. There's just so many players that are above that they should not be above, and especially in Aaron Rodgers. And on this, at least they have Russell Wilson, unless they're above Russell Wilson, which I have no clue why 2 of them are above Russell Wilson, who should be undoubtedly a top 3 player in the league.
Yeah.
And the receiver list, what they value, they're just not as important as some positions. Yes, that doesn't mean you don't need them, because you still need some quality wide receivers, but they are not the same as some other positions that should be higher and deservingly so.
Yeah, look at the New England Patriots with their success. They had some good receivers. I think Julian Edelman, we can all agree, is a good receiver, but they were able to have so much success without ever having a top 5. The year they did have a top 5 receiver, maybe the number 1 receiver, they didn't win the Super Bowl, but obviously you saw what they did. So like you said, it's really a cherry on top. If they didn't have Randy Moss that year, they still would have been very good. They wouldn't have gone undefeated probably, in 2007. I'm talking about the New England Patriots, but
I will play devil's advocate for a second though. You could argue the reason they weren't as good last year was because of the weapons, and I believe that. So you do need there's a level.
It's gonna help you out,
right?
To a certain extent, a quarterback needs somebody to throw to. You need talent. You need somebody who's gonna have the ball in their hands and make something happen. Players who just flat out catch the ball. And I think to your point, we've seen the opposite, and we've seen where the lack of receiving value can really hurt a team, and that's the Philadelphia Eagles. So we've seen that was a clear example last year. So no, 100%. You do need receivers, but to a certain extent, when you reach a certain level with your receivers, with your team, then the better these receivers get, the more flashy they are, because the better they are, more diva-ish they become. Then it's just added flavor for that recipe. But the success, the pudding man, what's making stuff happen, isn't necessarily that. So that's not necessarily improving so much. So then when we bring it to this list and we're talking about the overall value, how you value the receiver position, having 3 receivers and having 3 quarterbacks in the top 10, showing that you really value these positions the same. I've mentioned it on the show before, and I truly believe this, that quarterback is the most valuable position in all of sports, not just football, but all of sports, because there's so much that goes with it. The mental aspect, the physical aspect as well, and you rely on so much, but the quarterback there's so much on his shoulders. The fact that you have 3 quarterbacks and 3 receivers on this list, and it's not like we're devaluing receivers. We talked about last Friday, this receiving, the top 5 receiving class, and even outside of that, if you want to talk about top 10 best receivers, it might be the greatest we've ever seen, at least. But to even put it on the same level as a quarterback and having these guys ahead of Russell Wilson, like you said, I do agree that he's a top 3 player, along with Patrick Mahomes and Aaron Donald. He should be right there. And I think Khalil Mack is a top 4 player. So those are my top 4. And then we'd have to, like you said it before, we're gonna have to make a top list. Yeah. But the 3 receivers in the top 10 is entirely too much.
And that's the thing. Remember when I said on the last topic or segment that we're not shitting on Deshaun Watson or Lamar Jackson because we're comparing you to Aaron Rodgers. He holds a little more weight than normal. So with these receivers, we're not shitting on the receivers, but we're comparing you to like a Russell Wilson and an Aaron Rodgers, so you have no business being over. That's the thing.
And position-wise, like
the value.
To your point, an 8 out of 10 receiver is less valuable than an 8 out of 10 quarterback. It just is what it is.
Yeah.
So if you're the best receiver in the NFL, and you got a quarterback that's the best receiver, the best quarterback in the NFL, that player's gonna be better. Like it just is what it is.
That's the thing. You can't value receiver because we all know the main ingredients to win in football is that quarterback, the offensive line, your front 7 or defensive ends mainly, and your corners. So those are the primary focus on building the success of the team. And a receiver doesn't mean you don't need to be needed. Not at all. It just means you're not the root of the success. Yes, you are needed, but it's like a lot of things. You need something, something to be helpful for success. But can I work around it? Do I necessarily need it? Can I add something else? Or maybe the value could be 80% of it for a different price or cost? Sure, kind of like running back. Then I can still be successful. That's all it is. Like, you're still extremely important. But it's just when we're comparing you to the quarterbacks and the value of the 3 quarterbacks there and the 3 receivers there, it's just where it turns both of us off and just doesn't make sense to me, or it shouldn't really make sense to anybody, to be honest.
Yeah, well, some positions is comparable, but quarterback, as we've been saying and really harping on, that's just not one that you can really compare a receiver to. A quarterback is a lot more valuable. We've seen teams lose a quarterback and the whole season turns around. When you lose a receiver, and it's not necessarily that much. And the another aspect to look at it as well is a receiver coming into the league, it has an easier time adapting and adjusting to the speed of the game, obviously, than a quarterback does. Now you see some quarterbacks, just like you see some receivers that don't fall in that. They have success right away. But it's just the positional the value. We don't believe that it's really comparable. And then I also don't think it's comparable to some defensive position, like a defensive end like Khalil Mack. I think is more valuable than a receiver as well. So I think I have Khalil Mack very high. Right. And he's not on this. I mean, if you think top 20 is high, but I think he's a top 5 player. I think defenders are are more valuable than receivers as well. So I would have my top defensive ends higher than I have my top wide receivers, unless this receiver is such an absolute freak. And I like Julio Jones. Like I said last week, I think Julio is the best receiver in the league. And I don't think the receiver list is wrong per se. I like the receiver. I like the receiver, how they rank the receivers. Those are my top 3 in that order. Julio, Michael Thomas, and DeAndre Hopkins. That's my order. But yeah, like I said, when you're trying to compare it to quarterbacks, then that's just kind of where you lose me a little bit. It's not the same. It doesn't hold the same value.
No, exactly right. And I'm not here saying that receivers are the least valuable position, because there's several other positions, I think, maybe not several, but there's other positions that I think are least valuable than receivers. But it's just when we compare it to the value of what their value of quarterback is and what everybody's value of a quarterback should be, and like you said, a defensive end like a Khalil Mack type player, or a kind of like a lockdown corner, or like a Bobby Wagner type of linebacker. Yeah, it's just those are a little more important. I would say a little more needed than a stud wide receiver. I'm not saying you're not needed receivers, but those might be a little more needed for success of a football team. Not to mention the leadership aspect tends to come from positions outside of wide receiver. So, like you said, a linebacker, defenders in general. So that's another aspect to look at as well.